You have to take ultimate responsibility, in that, in some sense, the things that happen around you. I mean, this is... Dostoevsky, I think, said something like, every man is responsible for everything that happens to him and everything that happens to everyone else. And that's, you know, it's a crazy statement, right? It's a crazy statement, and he was a pretty extreme person in many, many ways. But there's a level at which that's metaphysically true, you know, because what happens is that it's failure to act often that's the most catastrophic, you know. I mean, it's to not do the right thing when the situation presents itself. And it's very specific. You know, you're constantly in situations where you could do the right thing if you were willing to take a risk that's actually of relatively moderate size. And you know that you could take the risk, and you know that you should take the risk, and you don't. And that happens to people all the time. And then what happens is the thing that they didn't oppose grows a little bit, and they shrink a little bit. And that starts a loop, hey? And you say, well, how do you take responsibility for the world? And the answer is, well, you also have to do it with a certain degree of humility, because what do you know? You know, and this is part of the reason that I'm so opposed to the activist culture on college campuses. You don't teach 18-year-olds to go and demonstrate about capitalism, you know, because they don't know anything, and they have problems in their own life that need to be solved that are local. And the local problems aren't trivial, you know. They're not disciplined. They're not looking at the world in a straight way. They're not taking responsibility for themselves or for their actions, their sexual actions, among others. They're not taking responsibility for their family. They're not looking at how they could contribute to the community. They don't understand the fact that they don't know anything. And so they should be taught to start locally and to put things together that they could put together, you know, to make their bed and to clean up their room and to attend their classes with regularity if they're going to university, because that's part of the implicit contract, and to straighten up the things around them that are actually within their power to straighten up. And then what happens is that if you do that, let's say religiously, which I suppose would be the same as in a disciplined manner, that your realm of influence starts to grow, but it grows in a positive way. Just like you can end up in hell one step at a time, and that's extraordinarily well documented. You can end up at the opposite place of that one step at a time, but it's also that same gradual process. You don't get to leap from being a 17-year-old knothead who doesn't know anything and who isn't disciplined to the critic of Judeo-Christian society. You just don't know enough to do that, especially when you can look at your own life and think about how many things that you're doing that you know are wrong, that you could fix, that you aren't fixing. And that's the crucial thing. This mode of thinking isn't asking people to stretch themselves beyond what they're capable of. It's just asking them to stretch themselves to the point that they are capable of and seeing what happens. And that works. It works.
Trying to think of how to stop the loop of my sacrifices have been rejected, and the way that you stop that loop is, instead of saying my sacrifices were rejected, so my hard work, my effort, my everything that I'm doing to try and move forward, it's not working. And if you want to go towards hell, you keep saying, well, it's not working, but it's because of everyone else. They're rejecting me. They're not accepting what I've done. Whereas if you say to yourself, oh, it didn't work, okay, it's my fault. What can I do better? And that's how you start moving in the other direction, which is...
Yeah, well, at least you have control. And, you know, you don't even necessarily have to think it's your fault, although that's a reasonable way of looking at it. You could minimally just accept the fact that it's your responsibility. You're stuck with it, and you could actually change it. And once you know, too, that if you're failing repeatedly, then there's probably something wrong. It's possible that there's something wrong with the way that you're conceptualizing the world, because you have a choice, right? If you keep making sacrifices and they don't work, there's a binary choice, and one is, well, there's something wrong with the structure of reality, and the other is there's something wrong with your approach. And so then you might say, well, let's take the first idea, there's something wrong with the structure of reality. It's like, you're really going to say that, are you? You're really going to come out and say, I know enough to judge the nature of being. And And then the alternative is also quite frightening, because then, it's you that's making the mistakes, and you might be wrong at a really deep level, and that might mean that a lot of you has to burn off and be transformed. Maybe even things about yourself that you think are admirable and that you like, because your position, your self-conceptualization is so warped and wrong. And that's really daunting. But when people set themselves up as the judge of being, I've written about this a fair bit in my new book, which is called 12 Rules for Life. When people set themselves up as the judge of being, then they take on what can only be described as a kind of satanic arrogance, because they've actually taken to themselves the moral right to criticize the structure of existence itself. It's like, you better be careful when you do something like that, because you're setting yourself up as the judge of being. And the Columbine kids did that. Like, if you read what they wrote, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what they say, is that, I've taken on to myself the task of the judge of being and found it wanting. And so I'm going to cause as much mayhem as I possibly can before I depart. And that's a very common story among people who do that sort of thing. It's so interesting, because every time something like that happens, people go, well, we don't understand. It's like, no, you won't understand, because they write about what they're doing. They tell you why they're doing it. But it cuts too close to the bone for people. And so they think, well, we don't understand how that can happen. Like there was a while back, I think it was in Connecticut, where there was a bunch of elementary school kids shot, right? Because this is kind of a one-upmanship game. And it's bad enough to shoot high school kids, but it's even worse to shoot kindergarten and elementary kids, because they're even clearly more innocent. It's like, well, that's part of that vengeful spirit, Better to punish the innocent than the guilty if you're trying to make a statement about your hatred for the structure of reality. And these things, you have to understand these things. Really, you have to understand them at a religious level of analysis, because that's what happens when you encounter evil, is that you're into the domain that can only be described by religious ideation. And I don't say that lightly. I've had many veterans come to talk to me now, and there are people who had post-traumatic stress disorder. And they've said that listening to my lectures has helped them out a lot, because it's provided them with a philosophy of good and evil. And if you have post-traumatic stress disorder, you need a sophisticated philosophy of good and evil, because otherwise you don't have any place to put your experiences. And that fragments and shatters you. It's no trivial matter to be touched by malevolence, or to have it manifest itself within you unexpectedly. It's physiologically destructive. It shatters people. And you have to move from a naive interpretation of the world to a very deep interpretation of the world if you're ever going to dig yourself out of that hole.